Hello and welcome to Transforming Tomorrow, the podcast from the Pentland Centre for Sustainability in Business here at Lancaster University Management School. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jan Babington.
And today, Jan, we're not joined by anyone. It's you in the hot seat. The pressure's on.
I'm just going to, I already know I'm in so much trouble.
You definitely are, especially because you sent me an email with the title Wicked, Clumsy and Post-Normal, which I took to be particularly offensive and wondering where you were getting your insults from.
They're very sophisticated insults with come from decision sciences, so slightly nerdy, but hopefully interesting as we unpack each one of those terms.
Yes, we thought it was time to dig into the nature of problems that researchers in sustainability in business tackle. We've mentioned the term wicked and wickedness and wicked problems a couple of times in the podcast, and I know it will come up again. And so that we can look at the content of challenges such as forced labour, biodiversity impacts, and the dynamics of the problem space. So, the first time we heard wicked was in Georgiana Allison's podcast. We were talking about the problems that universities face around tackling sustainability and issues like that. And there are all kinds of other new terms that you have, Jan. Clumsy, wicked, post-normal science. Lots of things that I'm sure aren't real, and you just want to say them to me because you want to, fire these words at me because it's about time you've got some, insults and barbs in.
Well, try me out. Ask me about them and you'll find out they are real. I'm not just having you on.
First of all then, why did this language of wicked, clumsy solutions, post-normal science develop, and how does it link to the Sustainable Development Goals?
Well, this language has been around for quite a while, sort of from about the 1970s onwards. And it really started to come about when we were facing some hugely complex problems of modern society, where people had lots of different views about whether or not nuclear power, for example, was a good idea, and that their views weren't right and wrong in any normal sense, but rather there are really good reasons why you would disagree. And so it was developed as a way of trying to understand how do we still act when the problem space is very complex and we disagree about how we might proceed. And this, of course, comes back to the SDGs. So you can look at those 17 SDGs and they sort of line up and they're colourful and they look like interesting things to deal with. And you can't really disagree with any of them. But it doesn't mean they're easily resolvable. And indeed, it was Georgiana in episode 19 who said that she didn't really like the SDGs in some sense because of some of that. They don't highlight that problem nature. Likewise, Adrian Friday in episode 5 was quite clear that it's a great list, but it doesn't talk about the tensions. And so wickedness, if you like, is embedded within the SDGs. And even though we have this list of the 17, the huge complexity of the world they're trying to act in and their trade-offs between them and the tensions between them is wicked. And that's the kind of language that's used for these sets of problems.
Okay then, Jan, so what is a wickedness problem?
Well, to answer that, you have to kind of think about what kind of problems there are. And at the bottom of this podcast, we're going to put a link to something called the Carnarvon framework, which is developed by Dave Snowden. And I like this framework because it says how you're going to deal with a problem area depends on what kind of problem it is. So if it's an ordered problem, which could be either simple or complicated, then you know that there's a well-defined relationship between cause and effect. It's predictable, maybe it's known in advance, and so you can craft a solution. So when you see a problem of that sort, you've got maybe 2 or 3 different ways of resolving it. When it gets complicated then, it's not so easy to see the cause and effect. So what you probably need is well-honed expertise, perhaps from somebody who's been trained over many years and is a professional exponent of expertise to be able to deal with that problem. And so those complicated problems then might have a different response. But when you're in complex systems, which is where we are with sustainable development, what we have is a system without clear causality, but also the causality changes over time. And then it's what we would call reflexive. That is, as you intervene in the system, the nature of the relationships change. Mm-hmm. So if you recall, JB was talking about leverage points. Where could you intervene in a system to change the whole thing? So that's an idea of reflexivity. But he was also talking about tipping points and how a system can go from one state to another very quickly. So it's these kind of problem spaces that are wicked, because it's not easy and straightforward to be able to think about what to do with them.
Yeah, I think I've been reading very recently about tipping point with regard to the Atlantic currents.
Yes,
that was
indeed.
something that was in the news not that long ago. And so, yeah, tipping points are something that quite often get mentioned in terms of changes with climate change, etc. Different types of tipping points and different markers for knowing that you've reached a certain tipping point.
Indeed. And one of the things I like about is a really cool quote from Lawrence J. Peter about wicked problems. And he describes them as problems that are so complex, one has to be very well informed to be uncertain about them. And this is a point I'll come back to in several times in this podcast. And sometimes it's described as the technology of humility. Actually, being uncertain is probably a good sign. And changing your mind is also probably a good sign. But of course, it's quite sort of daunting if it's so hard and so complex. What on earth do you do? And you get into clumsy solutions, which is sort of telling you where you're going to. But also, it's kind of coming back to a recent conversation we had about either, I think it was with Celine, that either, it's such a disaster you can't act, or it's just going to be fine. And it's Funtovics and Ravitz, who are the earliest people that put together some of the thinking around this. They said a counsel of perfection is indistinguishable from a counsel of despair. And so it's particularly, I'm not a perfectionist. I wish I could be perfected, but I'm not. So in that respect, if you like, you've got these non-trivial outcomes, you've got reasonably formed people that have very different views, there may be a lack of trust in the situation where you're trying to act, but you still have to act. So that, if you like, is the absolute essence of wickedness.
Are there examples of the work that's taking place within the Pentland Centre that fit in with wicked problems?
Yes, indeed. And the thing I'll go back to is a couple of episodes that we've already had. One, episode 5, which was Linda Hendry talking about modern slavery, and then Mahmood Gard in episode 15 was also talking about the reporting on that issue as well. And in some ways, you would have noticed I'm referring to past episodes, so it now starts feeling like an advertising feature on behalf of myself, which is really quite unedifying. But it's more to say that we've been talking about this, but we haven't necessarily called it wicked, because you don't have to, but it does help to know something about the theory behind it. So let's recap on modern slavery. So it's a problem with quite a bit of contestation in around the definitions of modern slavery. So, for example, under state-sponsored forced labour, if you have people in prison and you make them work, then that's considered to be forced labour. Except for the US doesn't buy that because they have prison labour. And so in that respect, if you like, what is the problem in the nature of a definition of forced labour is hugely contested, because it offends people in various countries as to whether that's fine.
Would that be talking about things such as chain gangs?
Yes,
the
indeed.
traditional chain gang that you picture,
Yeah.
Someone stood there with a pickaxe wearing a black and white striped outfit. Yes, that's the kind of forced labour that would come under this definition, yeah.
Yes, but also lots of prisons in the US sell goods and services, particularly goods, and they are made within the prison walls, and the wage rate that's paid for them is not a full wage rate. So that's an activity which is understandable and legal in that country, but which would be contested in other countries.
This may be a question you do or do not know the answer to. Is there not a similar situation in prisons in the UK and others where inmates can make an income or of some kind, or is that done on a different basis?
I think it's dependent on how it's constructed, because with modern slavery, it's the element of coercion. So if you can choose to, then that's one thing. If it's not a decent wage, and that's another set of problems, which I think colleagues in the Work Foundation would have some views about. So, contested problem. Next thing, it's urgent. So if we think about human rights and forced labour and modern slavery, any moment someone's in forced labour or any moment a child is in child labour is a moment too long. So it's a sense of urgency, and it absolutely need to sort it out. The next thing that's quite often the characteristic of it is that the data that you need in order to be informed to make the decision is often missing. And this is also the case with modern slavery. Because it's a hidden and illegal practice, it's sometimes very hard to know how much modern slavery that you've got. So then the question is, well, what do you do? And so one of the things that some people advocate, particularly when you've got an informal sort of workforce with seasonal work, is that you often get employment brokers, so people that match up workers with people who want workers. And if they are unscrupulous and they charge you a lot of money to make that connection, then it can lead to bonded and forced labour because you can't earn enough to get out of the debt. So you might say, okay, well, let's ban them. But the thing is, they are doing a function in the system. And so if you ban them, what you might end up with is an inability of workers to be connected to working opportunities. So in that respect, you're trying to reform a process, but then it might be about reforming the bad actors. So you might need a way of actually understanding which brokers are okay, which ones aren't. You might have a licensing regime and an inspection regime, for example, and therefore you could come at a solution to it. So that's an example of a wicked problem where if you take a set of actions, you get that reflexive changing going through. Then on modern slavery as well, the last thing is, and this is another characteristic of wicked problems, is that we don't really know, there's differing views on how they come about. So is globalisation and unequal development the root cause of modern slavery? In which case you might look at economic policies. Is it unscrupulous middlemen, in which case you'd look at regulating the middlemen who are connecting people together? Is it about corporations driving down costs in their supply chain, in which case you might want transparency on the supply chain? You might say, and it's not always the case, but a lot of times it is women being exploited in these chains. Okay, so gender equity is the answer. So what you've got there, if you like, is this different ways of framing the problem, none of which are wrong. Different ways of thinking about what you might do next. Again, none of which are wrong, but they are all different in their explanation of the setting.
One of the things when I've been reading about wicked problems seems to suggest that maybe solutions aren't always permanent solutions either. That a solution that you might come up with might solve the problem for now, but it's not necessarily getting rid of that problem forever.
Absolutely, and this is something else that I like about the Carnarvon framework, is that it describes that if you've got a complex problem setting, then you want to design fail-safe experiments. So you actually don't start intervening in the system until you know how you are going to dampen down whatever intervention you've got if it heads off in a wrong direction, and to have a different way of thinking about the problem. So whereas with something that's complicated but quite well ordered, you might go for a professional. If it's complex, you might go for pilots, experimentation. You would certainly expand the number of people you talk to about how is this going to work to try to actually get a better sense of the overall picture. But this idea about being able to amplify or dampen down approaches that you've adopted would also be a hallmark of how you respond to situations like that.
One problem I do have with the Carnarvon framework is that when I looked at it, I wanted to read it as Sinifin.
Yes, I spent many years pronouncing it like that, but my Welsh is non-existent, but I can say the Carnarvon framework.
Because it's not spelt as in the town or city in Wales, but it's pronounced the same way.
Yes.
There you go. Strange. But then Welsh spellings are beyond me in many ways, so that's that. Does this kind of work, research, tie in with what goes on across the interdisciplinarity that we see a lot of across the Pentland Centre?
Yes, and this is why interdisciplinarity is kind of a smart idea, but also really hard to realise as well, because each one of us has a little bit of the answer to a complex problem. And I think some of the podcasts we've had, particularly with our two legal colleagues, but also with Celine from political science, was really quite interesting as well, to realise where we start to piece together a picture of the problem area and therefore the relative contribution from various disciplines. So if you're a lawyer, you'll see the world in some ways. If you're a supply chain expert, maybe in another. If you're an accounting scholar, you see the world in quite particular ways, and the evidence you're drawn towards is what companies say about themselves. And so you might start putting these things together. And if we think about modern slavery again, so the law, if you like, encodes the basic expectations. In the area of forced labour and modern slavery, the law is passed in each country, but it's also at a much higher level as well. It's something called compelling law, which is in the international system, a country couldn't pass a law to make slavery legal because it is so accepted as being not a thing you can do. But then if you're coming from economics and you need this as part of the solution as well, the economics of enforcement would be quite important. So how much money do you put into labour inspection and the degree of the fines in order to shape behaviour? Certainly looking at forced labour in South America, what Brazil did when it drove a whole lot out of its system quite a few years ago is that they did a massive uplift in funding for labour inspections. And so that really made a huge difference because if you don't know it's there, you can't do anything about it. If you're into management science and you're thinking about forced labour, you might be thinking of policy processes and their implementation within the organisation. For a supply chain person, you'll be looking at how supply chains are constructed and the kind of data that might flow up and down them. Detection, well, that's audit processes, and then reporting, which we know from a mood is not very good yet because people seem to be unable to. And then you might also think about if you're interested in NGOs and their social intermediation role, you'd want to see how they come into being. And then I dare hardly to say it, but benchmarking might also be part of the process for learning, but also for raising people's games.
Can we just put that at the bottom of the list? The least important of all these things. Let's rank it bottom.
Yes, okay. So you've got maybe about 8 or 9 things there. All of those things will give you a view on the problem, but also a partial imprint on what the solution might be. So the idea is that you'd want to bring all of those together. But of course, all of the scholars in this area and all of the practitioners as well speak a different language, see a different part of the system. So interdisciplinarity that would allow them to see this bigger picture is really important in these wicked problem settings.
Now, the next thing that came from the wicked problems was the mention of post-normal science. First of all, I'd like to know what post-normal science means, but then how it's come to a fore as a result of tackling these wicked problems.
And because it's post-normal, you have to figure out what normal science is.
That's a whole different question.
It is.
Is there a normal scientist?
Yeah, that's a different question again. So Kuhn wrote a really influential book on how paradigms change in science. And his model of how it happens is that there might be an accepted understanding of the world. Say the Earth is at the middle of the universe, used to be an acceptable understanding. And people build up knowledge until it starts falling apart, and then they have tricks to make that knowledge work. And then some stage, there's a paradigm change and there's a new accepted model of what the answer is about how the universe, in this case, is being put together. So in that respect, normal science has a system that can be perfected, that you can find all the rules for, and you work on the knowledge, and then you come up with the answer. And then the answer kind of holds until people realise that maybe some of the orbits of the planets are a wee bit different or whatever. So normal science can do that, say on a physical system. It can't do it on wicked problems because you've got this different kind of context. So post-normal science characterises 2 elements of the problem. Firstly, how uncertain the system is, which goes from low to high as you can imagine, and then the decision stakes, which comes back to the urgency element. So whether or not this decision stakes are low or high. Where both of these things are low, decent science will answer your question. Okay. When each of them start getting more complicated, you're into that area of professional judgment and consultancy. But when it gets bigger again, nobody has a professional judgment to be able to answer the question because it might be a novel situation or it might be a rapidly moving situation. And so hence you get to post-normal science, where you have to somehow hold that complexity and uncertainty, ask from as many disciplines as you can, and I ran through a list of possible ones for modern slavery, but also then get into what they call extended peer communities. So in science, we usually think other scientists can judge our work. But in post-normal science, it's not just other scientists that have knowledge. So in that respect, if you like, a bigger group of people are involved in both defining the questions and trying to resolve the problems.
Who is coming in to help try and define these problems?
So I'm going to take another example that was spoken about in podcasts in the not too recent past with Celine, looking at sea level rise on vulnerable islands. So a post-normal approach would, of course, have science at the heart of it. So how much sea level rise is expected, intensity of storms and what that will do. So you certainly have the oceanography would be in there. But those who suffer the problem will have the strongest insight into what to do next. And so really not doing things to people but with people becomes very, very important in that context. In addition, the knowledge of what to do in problem areas quite often has been honed by generations and generations of insight. So this is where taking very serious attention to Indigenous knowledge becomes really quite important, because people who have lived and closely observed their environment will know a great deal about it, which our scientific methods might not detect or might not even know what to look for to detect. But then alongside that, you might put plant ecologists, how to breed plants who are more able to deal with salinity, through to soil science for thinking about how is that salinity going to affect the productivity of the soil, etc. So these extended peer communities are not just interdisciplinary, but people who are affected by the problems and who have day-to-day experiences of it. So we're coming around to a term that JB, I think, first coined in his podcast on ocean, and that you're looking at transdisciplinary science as well, so science with communities where they're affected.
That's also what Katie Mason a long time ago talked about with digital inequalities and the work she was doing in Yorkshire and Cumbria with regards to 5G and how getting the community involved from the start, that was such an important element to it.
And she didn't use the language, but that was post-normal. Okay, so it's not the thing that we've come to expect of somebody with a clipboard and a white coat, but it's something much more dynamic and something much more inclusive.
So if we've got to a stage where there's no definitive way to understand the dynamics of a problem and solution, is this where we come to being clumsy?
Yes, and this is great for anyone who can't cross a room without tripping over. Then this is, clumsy is good in this context. So it's what we've already spoken about, particularly of having a pilot or a fail-safe experiment. That would be a clumsy way of dealing with the issues. Other things that might be not saying I'm going to go to here, a pinpoint into the future, but I might going to move away from something worse, sort of on a vector or a direction of travel would be a way of thinking about clumsiness. Clumsy is also taking the time and investing the time and making sure that you regularly touch down with everyone, that you look at, in scientific terms, you might retest whether or not the ecosystem is working the way you thought it was going to, and to have a really good look at that. A clumsy way would also to make sure you've got all the skills in the room, and that would include technical skills and insight, but also to have people involved in a process whose skill is helping people to be involved in the process. There's also skills, a clumsy way to have is to always have someone, if you can, in a decision-making context, who is the guardian of ethics, who would be able to say, but is it right? Is it just? And so certainly in some clumsy processes, policy processes I've been in, there's often been somebody from a faith community there because they have the authority and the standing to say, but is that just? And so that would be an important part to have in it. And the other thing, I suppose, which is coming from one of your earlier questions, you also, a clumsy way is that you don't think, we've solved that, and you skip off into the distance, but you go, okay, there will be things that come from our solution that are problematic, and now we have to solve them. So it's an iteration. You can, of course, celebrate and have joy in your life, but wicked problems spawn other wicked problems when you start to intervene in them. So there is no stopping rule, which it can be quite daunting, but which is probably quite true.
Now, coming at this from the pessimistic, what's everyone going to say perspective. So if we're no longer necessarily relying on concrete facts, is there a danger that we're entering a post-truth world where anyone can say anything and people can back them up or not back them up or disagree with them? And how do we avoid that happening?
I think there is a sense in which some of the post-truth players actually exploit uncertainty and exploit being reasonably unsure about things, if you're being sophisticated and thinking about your problem space. That doesn't mean there's not facts. So islands will be swallowed up by sea level rise. That would be something, so you can't post-truth that. But likewise, someone facing appalling labour conditions, you can't, say, well, that's not happening unless you want to really sort of lie. So what we do need is we need to be more cautious about truths that we claim, but not that there is also false as well. So I think it's in a really sort of difficult, sticky period in between. It's also then sometimes people talk about quality. And so how do you reach agreement which has high quality? And that might be involving all the people that you ought to involve, or it might be a process that allows everyone's views to be heard. So sometimes people talk about the quality of the process, which will generate something that is more truthful or more accurate in a way. And in particular, if I think about the post-truth world, if you're using this as a way of saying anything goes because I quite fancy it, then you're probably not doing post-normal science. Okay, so if you are being completely sort of deceptive about something, then you're not actually playing by the rules of these games. And not that you need to play by the rules of these games, but you're in a different confrontation.
It's the people who don't like to go by any kind of facts, so they can just feel they can make anything up, which takes me to my next point, that if you're lacking definitive proof and solutions, does it contribute to the likes of climate change deniers? If something doesn't happen, when it doesn't happen, if something doesn't work.
Yes, and being honest about the limits of your knowledge can backfire in those ways if you've got bad faith actors in the system. But at the same time, there is something about being really challenging yourself on what's going on. So I used to do this exercise with classes and say, okay, who thinks climate change is a real thing? And there'd be a sea of hands. And I said, okay, I'd like you to lay out what would make you change your mind about that. Because otherwise we do buy into, definitely it's climate change. Now, I believe that. I think I've got scientific backing for that. But a clumsy solution and an attention to wickedness means that you have to push yourself and say, okay, well, what evidence would cause me to change my mind? Because otherwise, a lot of us is articles of faith, and we also know from looking at prior experiments in the world that scientifically we've made lots of bad mistakes in the past. So you have to be alert to the fact that you might be entirely wrong. Now, that's hard for anyone because we're all human beings, but I think that's actually really quite hard for academics as well, because our status is built on expertise and depth of expertise. So being able to say, I don't know, I think it might lie in this direction is I think, quite difficult for people to do. And then if you're a politician or a leader who has to now make those kind of statements, I think it's more difficult again. So this isn't easy science. This is science that will keep you awake at night, but it's also not science that you can just yell at people and they will have to accept it. It's an ongoing negotiation all the time.
So putting you in the place of your former students, what would need to happen to convince you that climate change wasn't real?
I think I'd probably need evidence that the nature of the climate system is not as we thought it was, or for some reason, because of the forcing that's happening on at the moment, it's turning it to switch in a particular way. I might also need evidence that a currently unknown mechanism is going to dampen down the positive feedback effect that we're living through at the moment. So I don't think it's aerosols, but I don't know. There might be something else in the system that's suddenly going to change the context that we're in. Yeah, so it's those kind of things. So it's science that is hitherto not understood and not presented.
So even you as an experienced professor have, like you said, you've got to have that level where you say, well, if that happened, then yeah, I was wrong.
Yeah. And I think in the natural world, you can think of a science that would come with it. But if we sort of circle all the way back around, if we're in a situation where reasonably well-informed people can disagree on what the answer is, then you have to be perhaps even more humble and live that humility even further and say, well, I think that this is what's happening in this particular social setting, but I could be entirely wrong. And I can only see it through my eyes. I need a way of seeing it through other people's eyes as well. So I hope this isn't a counsel of despair, but rather a counsel of being very formal and tough about what you're doing and making sense of what's going on. And I really think of a quote that confidence doesn't come from having all the answers. It comes from being open to all the questions.
And on that note, let's draw this episode to a close.
Did I pass, Paul? Did I pass?
I think you might have to do a reset. Speaking of questions, we have had some questions in, and if you would like to send us some questions about the topics we've discussed over the past many episodes of Transforming Tomorrow, please do. Please email us pentlandcentre@lancaster.ac.uk, and in the very near future we will be doing an episode where we'll be answering all of those questions as best we can. Next time, Jan, we're going to be joined by Dr. Marion Izzet-White from here in Lancaster University Management School. She's going to be talking to us about issues of leadership and stewardship within business.
Brilliant. I look forward to that.
Jolly good. Until then, I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jan Bebbington.